So today I'm going to talk only about sports, but I hope you get the message that this certainly has implications for all sorts of performance and human performance situations. So today I'm going to talk about Michael Jordan. Most of you probably know him. And actually Michael Jordan, probably one of the best basketball players of all time. In his career, he missed over 9,000 shots in matches. He lost more than 300 games in his career. And also, his team gave him more than 26 times the ball, the final ball to make the shot to either win or lose the match, and he missed. So he lost the match for his team in this very situation. And despite all of these things, he's one of the greatest athletes to have ever played the game. And according to him, it's even because he always failed and failed and failed. He is one of the best athletes because he just keeps on working and keeps on improving. So failing and returning from failure to your previous level of performance, in psychology we talk about resilience, the bouncing back, the process of returning to your previous level of performance. And when you look at Michael Jordan, you can see that this bouncing back, this process occurs on multiple timescales. So the example of him missing a shot would be probably the top example. Within several seconds, he has to bounce back within a match. Once you go there, you throw the ball, you miss. The next situation is around the corner right away. So you have to snap back within seconds. Of course, when they gave him the match-winning ball and he missed, this probably took a couple of days. So this would be then the second example here, that it took maybe a couple of days for him to really get back in the mindset, get back in the mood to play again. So there, the time scale after the setback is much longer. And what many people don't even know is that in his high school career, so high school basketball, Michael Jordan was actually cut from his varsity team, so that's the first team in high school, when he was a sophomore, because he was simply not good enough. That probably had an impact on a much, much larger time scale. So here I just outlined months for the sake of demonstration. So there are different setbacks that can occur on different timescales, and it takes, of course, adequately long to recover from them. So the question is, of course, how comes? How can people be resilient? How do they manage, after all these setbacks, to just bounce back and act like nothing happened before? This in research started already in the 1980s when people were interested in how children at risk, for example, would not succumb to all these kind of pressures that they face. And research looked into many psychological factors, and they identified a seemingly endless list of psychological factors that are related to resilience. However, what is very important to know about these lists, this list of factors, is that they hardly ever predict outcomes across contexts or across individuals. So, for example, a person can utilize, for example, perceived social support in one context to manage to bounce back after a setback. However, in a different context, they might just rely on hope, confidence, motivation, or even completely other variables. So these factors are highly variable over time. And even they can have different valence. So there's research showing that perceived social support can have significantly positive effects on resilience, but at the same time also significantly negative effects. So when you over-rely on perceived social support or social support in general, this actually makes you less resilient. So the question, of course, is, what does this help us? What can we learn from this? And the clear answer is, well, resilience seems to be a very, very complex process. And today I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we can embrace this complexity and use this complexity in order to study resilience. So one very important notion of complexity is that it manifests itself in the actual behavior that a system is exerting. So when we look at this graph here, you can see, do I get this? No. That on the left-hand side, the y-axis displays athletic performance. So all these underlying components, these psychological components, but also physiological components, they interact over time and produce athletic performance. And what we can also do is, or what complexity science entails, is that this complexity can be unfolded over time. So when we establish a time series of just one variable, such as athletic performance, where all these underlying variables are interacting, we can unfold the complexity and the attractor state of this system. So why is this interesting? Because in resilience, as we've seen before, people have mainly focused on the factors that drive this process. And even though resilience is conceptualized as a dynamic process that unfolds over time, people have forgot to actually look at the actual process. So we know a lot of the factors that can drive resilience, but we do not know how these processes even look like. That's why you saw on the second slide also always the same graph from me, because so far we also do not know yet. We are about to figure out. So that's why we propose that we can use the complexity science and look at the actual behavior people exert and how this unfolds over time, and therefore zoom into the process. So this means we do not need to untangle all these dynamic factors that are underlying athletic performance, but just look at athletic performance per se as what it is. Why is this important, or what can we do with this? So on the top again, you see Michael Jordan. And as I talked to you before, what he did, he was managing to recover from every setback that he faced. On every time scale, he just came back and maybe even grew from this beyond. And this makes him probably one of the best athletes there ever is. On the bottom here, you see Danny Ferry. Probably none of you is familiar with him. Actually, he was one of the best college basketball players of his time, and maybe even all time. But the big difference between Michael Jordan and Danny Ferry is that Ferry hardly ever managed to play professional basketball at all. He hardly started any matches, and his career was really, really short. So what can we actually learn from these cases? So in the case of Michael Jordan, you see that he bounces back every time he has a setback. For Danny Ferry, you see that the process of returning to his baseline becomes longer and longer until he suffers really a critical transition. And this period in which a system requires more and more time to bounce back after a perturbation is called critically slowing down. And when we identify this period of critically slowing down, we can at least detect when a system is very, very close to a critical transition. So it's a very strong indicator when something is about to go seriously wrong. So in the case of Danny Ferry, if we untangle the complexity and the processes and see how these processes unfold over time, we can detect patterns in the temporal sequence of the performance to see whether something is about to take a drastic change. And therefore, we can actually move also interventions not to after the fact, but even before negative things happen. So usually when you think about interventions or so, it is after the fact something had gone completely wrong and we need to pick up the pieces and set everything up again. But when you are able to detect these periods of critical slowing down, so when it takes longer and longer, for example, for a system to recover from setbacks, we actually can put an intervention to when before something goes wrong. And we can take some steps in order to have the system recover and come back to its actual state of being adaptive, flexible, and being able to deal with these setbacks more efficiently. So the final or bottom line is that when we untangle all these factors that just give us an indication for how an individual is resilient or why an individual is resilient in one context, is not really going to help us to untangle when something is about to go wrong. So we need to embrace the complexity per se, study the time series, so what actually happens to the system, and then we can also have some indications of when things are changing, drastically shifting, and take steps to prevent, for example, negative shifts from happening. So how does this relate to what Nadine already promised you? How does this relate to your everyday performance? So everyday performance, all human performance, could be conceptualized as emerging from some complex interaction between many variables. So we have, of course, physiological components, psychological components, etc., on all various timescales, and they come together and produce performance. So when you look, for example, then at any given performance and you find a variable that captures all these dynamic interactions, we can also find in these processes, in these performance instances, the key moments when you're about to enter a critical transition. So then we can also prevent you from, when you're writing your papers or so and you're just really about to have a breakdown, we can have an intervention just at the right time that you either stop, do something else, get into a more positive momentum, and prevent one of these transitions. So the final message from me today is, after this very short talk here, is that for this complex dynamic process, we need to embrace the complexity of this process and not try to untangle all these factors and create a seemingly endless list of factors that can just give rise to resilience, but we need to study the process of resilience as such as what it is. So it is a process that unfolds over time. Thank you very much.